it makes us dumber. It makes us kind of not have to think as much. But the reality is the artificial intelligence, the irony is that it is trying to learn. Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast that sits at the intersection of missions theory and practice. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauli, a missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro De Leonardo, our church planner in Cisterna di Latina, and Jen Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hello.
This is, I'm looking forward to this mini series. How are you guys doing?
I'm good.
Doing well.
Well, then let's just jump right into it. Today, we're kicking off our mini series on AI and missions. So AI stands for artificial intelligence. And we're going to give a stab. We're going to see what we can learn, what we can decipher of artificial intelligence and missions. We're going to examine the 58 times that it's talked about in the Bible. Actually, I don't know if it's ever talked about in the Bible, but we're going to look at some of the theological, missiological implications. There was
definitely a king named AI.
There you go.
That's
See?
true. There you go.
So we got it in there a couple of times. See, Alessandro's coming through, our pastor. And so, we definitely want to just look into this conversation, see what we can understand kind of morally, ethically about it. How is it being used and maybe abused in certain situations? And then in the second episode, we actually will interview Ted Essler. He's the president of Missio Nexus. Yeah, we're gonna talk to him about how he and other missions leaders are currently using AI, and then he's gonna recommend and offer some tools for us to try. And in our last episode, we're gonna give kind of a review, kind of talk through having tried using AI on different scenarios to see how that played out for us. So let's jump off right from the beginning and just talk about what have you guys been hearing about AI? What are some things maybe that you've wondered, okay, is that ethically right or is that wrong? What have you guys heard about AI? And maybe, I guess I'll add to that question, how were you first introduced to this idea of artificial intelligence?
Well, as Alessandro pointed out just before we hit record, we were using it long before we were calling it AI because Google Translate is artificial intelligence. So I would say that was probably my first type of use into it, moving to a foreign country and you need to ask a question and you don't have all the words for it. And so much easier than pulling out a translation dictionary or even pulling up a translation dictionary online. Being able to just speak it in. And I mean, I've seen my sister use it with Chinese exchange students where she can, say a sentence in English into her phone and it will speak it out in Chinese to the other person. So that's a handy tool. People scan menus now to be able to read them. Language translation is just something we all use. And I don't think anybody's scared of. So that's an interesting thing because I know a lot of people are wary of AI. There's some people that have a lot of concerns about it. But I've never heard anyone say, oh, you used Google Translate? That's so scary.
Yeah, that's true. I know for me, my first introduction, besides the Google Translate example, is I got a message from one of my friends here in Italy, and he's like, "What do you think of this prayer?" I think it was, and I was reading it, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's a good prayer." Like, yeah, and then he's like, "Yeah, that prayer was written by ChatGPT," and I was like, "Whoa!" Like, I didn't know that, it was writing prayers. So I was like surprised by that. I sent that on to some other people that spoke Italian and they were like, oh yeah, that's a beautiful prayer that was written. And they were just shocked every time I told them like, no, that was actually written by a computer.
In my exposure, it's interesting. It's one of those things that even back when I was in college, I was already introduced to AI in the sense of like we were working because I graduated as a mechanical engineer and my wife computer engineer. So we were like working with robots and things like that. And so that was what we knew was going to come. Like to us, it wasn't something like it was new. So to me, what the first instance that actually was highlighted was in a negative part, when it was maybe 4 years ago, when someone got on the news because he wrote a book that was a children's book that was 100% AI, like both the pictures and the writing, the story. And that's the first time it's like, oh, okay, now it's getting so it's making the news. So it was a negative thing that kind of highlighted it for me. But to me, it was always sort of like, I don't even know where it went from. We were already using this, but now it has a name, AI.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that, like, how long was it being used in different ways, and we just weren't calling it what it was. I know more recently, it was a couple years back now, but more recently there was this, I think it was a German church, if I'm not mistaken, that actually had the whole sermon
It was the
done,
whole service, the
a
whole
service.
service. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think people respond with it. It lacked a little bit of soul or something like that was the response.
That's the perfect response.
Yeah, I've heard of an AI Jesus, AI like confessionals. Yeah. And for me, I mean, maybe this is jumping ahead a bit, but the biggest limitation that I think we need to recognize is that it's not embodied. And it can't be embodied, and it will never be embodied. So things like communion, I love so much that we have an embodied faith. Embodied not just in the sense that God became flesh. He didn't become artificial intelligence. He didn't become a voice from on high. He didn't become a divine download. He became flesh and dwelt among us. And then that the practice that he gave us as the body of believers was to break bread together, to share from one loaf of bread, everybody taking a bite, to share from one cup the same wine. And that practice being part of what draws us and knits us together as the body of Christ, those practices are so embodied that they cannot be done digitally. And so I appreciate that whatever AI is, it's not embodied. And even things like pastoring and sympathy and caring, there's scary things that can be out there. I've heard of like AI girlfriends and boyfriends now. And these are like apps that just tell you exactly what you want to hear. Isn't that great? No pushback, no challenges. Hey, baby, I love you and everything you do and everything about you. And you're great. And I'm always on your side. And I'm going to always take up for you. But that experience still can't give you a hug. It's definitely lacking in something.
When you say that embodied, it made me think of the idea where, if we kind of look at this trajectory where God created humans, he did all the physical part, right? Take the dirt, the dust. He added everything we needed. But then at the end of the day, that was just a body. He had to breathe into it. And I think we could do the same. Like we're grabbing all the components. Now actually AI can be embedded, and it is already embedded in robots and humanoids. And so like they could actually give you a hug. And you can do all of that stuff, but there's no way we could ever, as human, do what God did. We can't breathe into robots. We can't give them life. We can only have the body aspect. And so just interesting that God already gave us the opportunity to do that with making children, creating life, but we're still trying to then do that in a way. So it's good that you mentioned that, Jen.
Yeah. And the soul issue is real.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. What stood out to me from the beginning about this is that when I was a kid and we were talking about computers, it was always this idea that like you have to input information into the computer, and then the computer, responds to what you're putting input. And artificial intelligence is the same thing. Like it's essentially taking things that were inputted into the internet, into the World Wide Web, and then summarizing them or then converting them or drawing from that pool of input. And we know that reality is on the internet, everyone has a voice. Everyone can post freely, whatever they want.
Truth or fiction.
Exactly. There's no fact checkers, it's just kind of, and so consequently, like really AI is only drawing from what we've already inputted into it. And I think what what is interesting is, we talked about like Google Translate. I think even like at Google Maps, for example, like these things all have consequences. So like I love Google Maps. I use Google Maps a ton. I still make wrong turns every time I drive in Italy. I don't know. It's kind of like an ongoing joke in my circle of friends and family because I just can't read Google Maps when I'm driving for some reason. However, it's actually made me not remember, not know like my way around places as much because I just rely on the Google Maps.
It's so true. I've lived in Lyon for almost 10 years, and I still put it on to drive to the airport. Like, you would think after 10 years of going to the airport, and I don't think I need it. I think I know the way, but there's also like the traffic avoidant. Like there's also other benefits as well. Like I'll know what time I'm going to get there. There's things about it that I've become so dependent on, but I do think it makes us dumber. I used to have 20 phone numbers or more memorized. I don't even know my husband's phone number. Like you said, I can't navigate places very easily because I'm so dependent on it. But yeah, when I go back to the States where I'm from, where I learned to drive, I don't need it at all. I haven't lived in that place for over 25 years, and I can get everywhere I need to go without any trouble. The maps are embedded in my head. But places that I've lived since this has come into play, I cannot navigate. And technology it rewires us, and it always has. There's this great book called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, and the subtitle is How the Internet is Rewiring Our Brains. And it's years old. But it was talking about this, and like that even people used to eat when they were hungry and sleep when they were tired, and then we got clocks. And all of a sudden, we started eating according to what time of day it was and going to bed and waking up according to time versus just biology. And thus our brains were rewired. And then same with the printing press. That was a major rewiring because reading used to be a public event. It was done aloud, orally, and because books were handwritten and very expensive and transcribed, and all of a sudden, books became widely available. People became literate. But you will read and write things that you read and write to yourself that you would never read publicly. So it actually changed what we would express and what would be written and what would be shared. But he was talking about with the internet, and we know this stuff, but they gave people like these games to play. And in one game, prompts would come up that would say, hey, try this or do this or whatever. And at first, and then the other group didn't get the prompts. And at first, the group with the prompts performed way better than the groups that weren't getting any hints. But then they came back to the game like 2 weeks later, and the people who had no prompts were immediately performing way better than the people who had prompts because they actually learned how to play the game. They learned how to navigate the streets. The other group was learning to be dependent on the prompts. They were dependent on the Google Maps. So this rewiring, it's a real thing, which says let's be cautious. Technology will have an impact. There can be positive impacts and there can be negative impacts. And we can't act like it's not going to affect us or change us. We need to be wise and discerning.
No, definitely. That's the thing is, in a sense, like usually our third episode is about tools, but really this whole series is about a tool because artificial intelligence is just that. Like it's meant to be a tool. And like all tools, you can abuse it. You can use it different ways than it's supposed to be. And those have different variances of negative consequences or negative impact. I think of, a silly example is like when you try and use like a pair of pliers to hit a nail in. It's like, well, they're not meant to hit a nail in. You're supposed to use a hammer for that, but sometimes you are able to do it. Like, so there's going to be things that you can use AI for that maybe it's not the best thing to do, but you're able to get it done using it. And then there's just outright abuses where people like hurt people and use a set of pliers to hurt people and torture people. And it's like, well, yeah, that's not what they were intended for. They were intended to screw a bolt on it. But for me, I think the other aspect of artificial intelligence that's interesting is like you alluded to it, Jen. It makes us dumber. It makes us kind of not have to think as much. But the reality is the artificial intelligence, the irony is that it is trying to learn. So it's actually trying to learn, trying to improve itself. It's asking questions of you even like, hey, between these two things, which one sounds better? So it's trying to learn, whereas we're almost trying to not have to learn as much and not have to, sharpen ourselves by using it. So it's interesting, and I think it would be cool if we could kind of maybe shift a little bit the conversation and kind of maybe talk about some of these different things. Like, where do we see it being used really for good stuff and things that are helpful, and where do we see it kind of maybe being misused
Yeah.
in having a negative impact?
Well, we talked about Google Translate right at the beginning, and the impact that AI has had on Bible translation is enormous. It has significantly reduced the amount of time that it takes to translate the Bible into a new language. And yet, when I even use translators, I know French, it still needs a human touch. There's nuances, there's things it doesn't get 100% right. But I was talking recently with a leader, a mission leader, who works in an organization that's dedicated to Bible translation. And she said there are currently fewer than 1,000 known languages without a Bible. And that with the use of AI, it's going to be accomplished in an astounding rate of time compared to what it has taken historically. To the point that she's actually asking the question, what happens to our organization then? Do we just close our doors and say mission accomplished? I mean, can we imagine living in a world where the Bible exists in every known language? That's actually attainable.
Yeah, if I could share a personal story of what's currently happening in my church, we're not using Google Translate, we're using DeepL. We use that for transcribing. I write the sermons and then we're translating it to Chinese, because we have a woman who doesn't speak neither Italian nor English. We have no way of communicating with her, but she's been faithfully coming, and so we communicate through that, and then using Google Translate to talk while we were face to face. We use all sorts of things, but it's just really amazing how, yes, once in a while I get a friend who speaks Chinese to come through, and he can help be the mediator, but he can't always come. They're farther away. We live in a town, and so God's really used that as an opportunity for her to hear the gospel, and she's really close to making a decision to following Jesus. And so it's been an amazing, slow journey. But God's been using that, and so that's been really great.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a really bad writer, and just I've always been a really bad writer in all the languages. I only speak 2 languages, but in the 2 languages that I speak, I'm a bad writer in both. But what I've found it to be helpful with is it does more than the classic word spell check and grammar check, and so it helps me a lot with that. Like, I'll write what I want to say, but my punctuation's horrible. All this stuff is just really bad, and I guess this is also a confession of my laziness and trying to learn and improve my writing abilities. But it does help me to be able to give some nicer touches to the things I've written. I still often will have to have it reread. My wife is a phenomenal writer and editor, and so she always will look over things. And even after I've used something like ChatGPT to kind of correct it, she still finds things and says, "Oh no," like you were saying, Jen. But I think this idea of language is definitely a big one, where language abilities, because I don't know, I guess I don't know your guys' experience, but when I first moved to Italy when I was a child, obviously none of this stuff existed, or at least it wasn't, you couldn't have it in your hands and your cell phone to use right away. And so we had these little pocket dictionaries, and we had to flip through each page. Okay, he's speaking Italian, I'm speaking. Okay, so now I got to go back to the Italian side of the bio of the dictionary. But what was so hard with those is that it didn't conjugate the verb for you. So if the person said it, in the second person plural,
Right.
and you're trying to figure out it's like, how do you? And so it was so hard to figure those things out. And so I've just found that, from a language perspective, it's been really, really helpful. What I'm interested in for our second episode is to see kind of how leaders are using it, because I'm assuming there has to be some cool ways that leaders can use it for, whether it's just efficiency with administrative tasks and things like that.
I was reading about one organization called Christian Vision International or something that is using AI to track people's journeys to faith. So they're, asking all sorts of questions. And this is like all over the world, thousands of so the amount of data you can collect. And summarize and analyze with AI is so amazing. And what they can do is see what are their major themes or touch points as people make this journey from unbelief to full on committed faith in Jesus Christ. And then what can we learn from that as we develop evangelism and discipleship tools? That's the kind of thing that just would be almost impossible to do in a study that just requires human input and human analysis of data. So not just tools that we can use, but ways we can benefit from the tools that are being used, I think is also cool. Because I'm not doing that study, but the data would be interesting to me.
I think what you're sharing is kind of making me think about like there's something to using like the strength of whatever we're talking about. So like for example, it used to be maybe a man would plow a plot of land and then farm it. And then they started using animals because they were stronger. They were able to do it quicker. You know, it's like there's something to using a different thing. And so with automation, with technology, obviously that's taking away from people's work and people's jobs to some extent. Because yeah, some of these things like data collection, you know, compiling statistics, a lot of math things can be done with AI that are so much quicker. I was telling some friends, like I typed into ChatGPT, like, hey, can you please divide this and then add that other thing, and like but it was all like written out, and it figured it out and gave me but it showed me also the formula it used to get there and stuff, and it's like, okay, that's awesome, like that's a lot more helpful. But what I'm thinking about as we're talking about this is all of this still requires a human touch. At some point along the way, it requires a human touch. There has to be a human that's discerning if it's accurate or not. There's all these, like on ChatGPT in particular, there's all these disclaimers like this, it could be have errors. Please double check. Like it knows that it's not going to be perfect. Even if it is taking away certain jobs or certain things that were done by people before, in a way that could be seen as a benefit because it's freeing up people to do things that only people can do, which is
Exactly.
relate, which is to take care of each other, which is to do those things that no computer, no piece of technology, no robot, you know, will ever be able to do the way a human can do it. And so
Yeah.
we could look at it as, oh, it's taking away jobs, or we could look at it as it's creating opportunity for you to be 100% human in touch with your humanity more.
But also recognizing it's created in the image of humans, so it inherently has human flaws in it. And we're created in God's image, and we have the possibility of redemption through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and that sort of transformation. So I 100% agree. It buys me back a ton of time, AI, and I think my time is better spent in other areas than converting a list of emails into a spreadsheet. AI can do that for me in 3 seconds, and I didn't have to type in and enter anything. I just did a copy and paste, and that's great. At the same time, we need to be wary of it because, like you said, it's drawing from all sources, and that means not all sources are true. I've been in Bible studies where we've done a Bible study and asked, okay, what can we learn from the relationship between Moses and Jethro about mentoring? And we'll talk about lots of aspects of that relationship. And then we'll put the same question to AI. And it's interesting because it'll get a lot of the same ones. And we're like, man, it knows what we know. And yet it will get some that are kind of off and kind of wonky and kind of weird. And you're like, well, I don't think it's getting that exactly right. And it's flawed because it's created in our image and we're flawed.
You know, it's interesting though, it's because we read what the AI is thinking. People don't say everything they're thinking. So someone might have thought that that's funky once. That we're just not
someone
reading
clearly
it.
did because it drew from someone's idea of that, right? It's
Yeah.
not inventing it, it's finding it somewhere.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to mention is as a church planter, when you're lacking certain, like in my case, I'm blessed that my wife is a graphic designer, and so we get all sorts of cool things happening because she can do that kind of work. She's gifted in media. whereas most church planters don't start with that, and so they have to outsource. And so AI has been really great helping people with media stuff, things like that. But ultimately, I think anybody would want to have a media person in their team. I knew of a church. This is not really AI, but technology. I knew of a church that just couldn't get musically talented people in their church, so they were just using YouTube every Sunday. I don't think that they were happy. I don't think that they were like, yes, this is the future. They were like, we just don't have people, but we're gonna keep worshiping Jesus until someone comes that actually knows how to play the piano and sing and stuff like that. This is how it's gonna be done. And at first thought, it's like, YouTube, that's your worship team. But you kind of realize, sometimes it is a tool to help you. I think the problem could be if we get so fixated and the church becomes AI, everything, like I'm a one-man person and I could do it all because I got AI on my side. He's my helpmate,
Right.
my partner. I think that's where the issue could be.
Well, I think that's, talking about some of the, not just the limitations, but the risks means that as a minister of the gospel, I need to be thinking about how are we discipling people to be prepared to interact appropriately with a world that is going to have AI. It's going to be harder and harder to distinguish fact and fiction because photos can be manipulated. It used to be that if you had a picture of something, that was proof. This is the proof it happened. Well, we all know now you cannot, a photo can be completely generated and not be real. So how are we discipling people to live in a world where this is the technology and this is the reality? And I wonder what kinds of things do we need to step up and be thinking about? Like discernment for me is all of a sudden a key quality that we need to be helping people develop. We need to be helping people hunger for truth. We need to be helping people really know who Jesus is and what is the truth of his word, so that if someone posts something saying Jesus said this, they know if that's true or not. So I've been thinking a lot about, we can't change it. This is our world. We're not going to, you might have said 20 years ago, well, I'm just not going to get a smartphone. Okay, but you're not going to be able to function in the world much longer because this is the way it's going. In any conference I go to, you have to use the app now. It's just almost not possible to function without. And AI, it's going to be the same way. This is going to be the reality. So I think the question we have to ask is, how are we as believers preparing ourselves and preparing those to whom we minister for that reality?
Well, and I think in some ways, even that doesn't necessarily change a whole lot. I don't even know who to attribute this sermon illustration to, but many, many sermons, many different places I've been, I've heard the same illustration, that a banker is trained to look over and over and over again at a real piece of currency so that when someone tries to bring in the false currency, they recognize that it's false, right? I think that same concept is going to apply even with this sense of artificialness. We are not going to be able to have AI somehow download the Bible into our brains, or we need to be in the Word. We need to be looking at the truth of the Word for our own selves, and then maybe we try and supplement by using AI in some way to understand something. But if we've been spending time with the Lord and we are saved and have the Holy Spirit guiding us, then hopefully we should be able to discern and say, okay, yeah, like you were alluding to, something's off with that thing. Like there's a lot of truth in that generated response that they've given me, but there's also a lot of things that aren't quite true. And I know that because I know God's word. I know the truth.
Yeah, but the reality is, Jesse, at least from reports I've seen, Bible literacy is down. So most of Gen Z, particularly in the places we're living, and maybe also in the US, don't even have any context. If you talk about Moses, they don't even know what you're talking about. At least my generation, churched or unchurched, had a kind of a clue who Noah is, or who Moses is, or who Paul was, or those sorts of things. But Bible literacy is way down. So I agree that it's the same things that we've been taught from the beginning that we need to do. We need to know Jesus, so we recognize the counterfeits. What I'm concerned about is I'm not sure that we've maintained the same standards. And so now this, which is even more important because the risks of being duped are greater, is also a greater challenge because the reality of where people are with what they know is really different. And I say this because I look at things that I see posted places like Facebook by friends that I know who are Christians, who are believers. They're so infused with what is called Christian nationalism. I wish they would take that word out of it because there's not much that's Christian about it. Posting things that are clearly false and they believe them.
Yeah, one way to look at it is that this is like a repeating, something that's been repeating throughout the ages. I mean, for me, I have dealt early on in my ministry with people who believed in conspiracies. And of course, that doesn't mean that conspiracies don't exist, just to the level of what they believe in. And it was just, like, these are believing Christians who love Jesus, who study the Bible, but just conspiracy, we're so good at kind of follow the trail, look at this and stuff. And it was just, I think the key word is discernment. And how do we disciple people in developing that discernment? Obviously, we want people to read the Bible and be really familiar with it. But even if there's something that you didn't know, you would ask, okay, let me think about this. What could it be? What's going on here? And then even having a sense to say, okay, I'm not going to jump into this. Let me ask people who I think could give me a good direction and guidance in this regard. So yeah, discernment, teaching our people what Jesus was teaching, discernment to his disciples.
Yeah, my mentor and I were asked to speak at a missions web seminar on like generations and how the different generations work together now on the mission field. And in our research and preparation for that, one of the things that really stood out to us is that in this digital age, you have access to information, so much information, like you're saying, Jen, good, bad, wrong, right, fact, fiction. Like you just have access to so much out there. And so one of the things that we were coming to as a conclusion is that maybe when we're thinking about discipleship and we're thinking about evangelism, we're thinking about discernment, it's not so much more transmitting of information, but it's more trying to help people understand and sift through information and then seek to apply it. And so creating spaces, not so much where we give the answers or try and teach necessarily directly, this is stuff you need to memorize or learn, but more, hey, can you look up this? Can you study this? And let them go do their own reading, their own looking on the web and asking of Chat GPT or whatever. And then coming back, kind of to your point in our last episode on short-term missions, Alessandro, the debrief, kind of go have your experience, look up to it, and then let's sit down and talk about it. Let's sit down and kind of go through what you're thinking as a result of what you've found. And I think that could be a tool for the church to use in many ways. I'm not saying any pastor should get up on a Sunday and say, why don't you guys go look into what Hebrews 1 has to say, and then gets off the stage, and waits for that. But there's something to the effect of like you're discipling, you're walking with someone through something to say, hey, why don't you look into this? You have all the means. You can just pull it up on your phone and look through it. And then let's talk about what you find, what you've read, what you think about. And in that piece, able to apply like, okay, this is what scripture is saying. This is what we can know is true. This is where, see, you found that information, but we know that Satan is the father of all lies. So that's probably not something you want to follow there, and just, I think that component is always going to be necessary of kind of walking with someone and discerning what's right, what's wrong.
I think it's highlighting the importance of being in community, being active in community. If your church is online and I'm just saying, like, you attend a service on YouTube or whatever, but you're not living out your life in community, you're missing a key component of the Christian faith and actually a key safeguard that's built in for us, that's giving us that space, Jesse, to process together, like you're talking about, to even discerning together. There's so much more strength in that community saying together, how do we understand the times? How do we receive what's going on? What is our response as a body? How do we move into these spaces?
Yeah. as we start to come to an end in this episode, I want to bring up one thing real quick and talk just a little bit more specific about evangelism in AI, because I didn't tell you guys this, but I totally was gotten in the sense that I was on the internet and I was scrolling. I was on YouTube, and I was like just kind of scrolling, looking up some videos, and I saw this thing that had, I think it was Ed Sheeran or some pop star. They were singing a worship song. And so I was like, "What? I didn't know that they were a Christian." And now they're like singing a worship song. So I clicked on it, and it was totally artificial intelligence. Like, it was just so clear. The image was AI generated during the video. The voice was AI generated. Like, it was not the right. It sounded very similar, but you could just tell that it still wasn't quite the same.
Right now, you could tell, but soon we won't be able to tell.
Yeah. So I totally got by this, clickbait situation where I was listening to this worship song that was supposedly, sung by this pop star. And so obviously there's an ethical question that we can bring up there. And maybe we can get into that. But the other thing is, like, to me, I was wrestling with that situation because I felt like some Christian person thought that by doing this, they were somehow evangelizing. They were somehow going to get someone to click on this and believe or be more interested in Christianity because they were able to make a pop star, quote unquote, singing a worship song. And I just want to say, please, brothers and sisters in Christ, do not use a lie to try and get someone to believe in Jesus. Like, that was just, I was so frustrated with quote unquote Christians when I saw that video and how they were using this AI generated fake 100% not true situation to try and get people to click and be curious about Christianity.
Well, obviously, we don't want to ever lie to evangelize, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's the motive behind it. I don't know what the motive behind that is, but I just know that I grew up loving watching trailers. I just, there was something, me and my families, when we were popping a VHS, we were watching the trailers were the thing. I don't know, we just loved it, and I still today love watching trailers. I don't know why. I mean, it's part of my childhood. But there was a time, they don't do it as much anymore, but there was a good, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, where people were making fake trailers, and it would get me so mad. Like, they would just make them because it was a thing. And the behind it was because the technology was coming out that they could make fake trailers, and people who were into that technology, they thought it was awesome to be able to create a trailer. But to me, it was making me so angry. So people sometimes, they just love technology and they love to see how far it can go and push it. They're not really thinking, I hope people come to Christ with this. I hope they're thinking, like, isn't that cool that I could make this guy who's not a believer sing worship song and stuff? So I think even that we have to, like, but the implications that it can have. It would break my soul when I would think that there was a new movie coming out, and then I found out it was a fake movie.
Well, I just think it's wrong. I'm just gonna say I think it was wrong. I'm still a little bit salty or bitter about this situation. I'm like, come on, man.
You're just
totally
mad because they
fell
got you. That's why you're mad.
that is definitely part of it. That is definitely part of it. Well, this has been great. In our next episode, we are going to interview, as we mentioned earlier, Ted Essler. And we'll learn of different ways that we might benefit from AI in our work. Before we end the episode, we should touch on some of the limitations or even risk associated with AI. Like, we talked about this already, I think, earlier, about the idea of, like, the risk is falsifying things. The risk is wrong information being put out there. Inevitably, now someone's going to Google a question about Christianity, probably before they go to a Christian to ask it. There's also, as Jen was talking about, the situation that our faith is an embodied faith. It was God coming in the flesh to die on a cross for us. Like, it's much more than just an artificial intelligence could ever be.
Yeah, I wonder too if a risk could be that that we start depending on it for community, or we start to believe that that is where we're socializing, where we're networking, and we're not living in with embodied friendships, having a meal together, playing a game together that is like face to face, holding cards or pieces, or going on walks together, or all of those things that I think help us stay attached to reality and to what's going on in the world, and to being participators and not just theoretically engaged in some mystical way. We are called to be living and active in the world, and that is not just happening behind a screen.
Yeah. We want to make sure that we know that there's no shortcuts, I guess, is what I would say. There's no shortcuts. And so sometimes we want to use tools, we want to use things to try and make things quicker, more efficient, or somehow shortcut. But when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our relationship with God, despite however many AI boyfriend, girlfriends, and whatever else can be out there, it sounds so weird to even say, none of this stuff can ever substitute your personal relationship with Jesus. So, hey, we wanted to say thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation, found it insightful, or maybe you found it as confusing and hard to wrestle with as we were. But just know your ministry is so important to us, and we hope that you consider your time with us as an investment in the work that you do. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends. And until next time, keep going wherever Jesus leads.